Hello everybody, thank you very much for coming along this afternoon to Troy Books HQ to hear me introduce my brand new work, The Liminal Shore. Now I'm very excited about this work because it's been a long time in the planning. In fact, I could take this right back to 1975 when I was 10 years old. I picked up an article in an old magazine which was called This Essex, which went out of print in about 1987. So there's only a few editions ever produced, but the first edition came out in 1975, and there was an article in there by an author who was writing about a character called Job Summers, who was an alleged ghost hunter from the folklore archive of Essex. And although I didn't really understand what I was reading at the time, only being 10 years old, it really sparked off something within me that made me interested in my local surroundings and the history of the ghost lore, and later on the history of the witchcraft and other folkloric narratives of the Essex coast. I should just add really that many people might know me from my previous work From Granite to Sea and know that I write a lot about Cornish folklore. But for the first 29 years of my life I lived in Essex, on the Essex coast, and I was born and brought up in a village called Hatfield Peveril, and this is right in the centre of eastern Essex, not on the coast but just inland a bit from the edge. The nearest coastal town to me was Malden, and I would spend many a happy hour during the school holidays sort of mucking about on the coastline around Malden and district. And it was there that I really first touched upon this idea of a liminal shore, although at the age of 10 I didn't know didn't have a clue what that would have meant. But in 1975 I also was taken to a really interesting spot on the shore by my parents, and this spot at Bradwell-on-Sea is the other point where I think this journey to this book began. There's a river in Essex called the River Blackwater, and it flows through central Essex out to the coast at Malden, and right out on the very end of the estuary is a village called Bradwell-on-Sea, and right at the end of the village, right out on the edge where the sea meets the river, there is an ancient 7th century chapel which was built by a monk from Lindisfarne called Keth in the 7th century in 650, and he and his followers sailed down from Lindisfarne in the northeast of England and set up this community to convert the pagan East Saxons at the request of the king at the time. And he built this chapel, and the chapel still exists and still stands to this day as one of the few examples of a chapel of that period. And the reason it still stands is because it was built of stone and not wood. And the reason it was built of stone is fascinating because the chapel stands on one of the walls of a Roman shore fort, Roman shore fort, okay, which were built all along the south and the east coasts during the Roman occupation to keep an eye out for invading Saxon ships. And when this was abandoned, the rubble from this fort was used to build this chapel in the 7th century. So that's why it still stands to this day. For many years it was used as a barn. It was also used as a smuggler's hideout in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and for a while it was in ruins. But this site really grabbed my attention as a 10-year-old child, and the entire area around this chapel, which is really on the edge of a desolate salt marsh, there's so much folklore here. It's haunted by a black shark. There are ghostly centurions moving about at night. The chapel is haunted. And there's even a legend of the old cunning woman called Diddy Horn, who actually lived on the edge of Bradwell-on-Sea, and she's still mentioned in the historic record as being the local cunning woman. So all of this is just in a tiny little area right on the edge of the estuary there. And that really was the start of my focus and my obsession with Essex folklore when I was growing up. Of course, we moved forward sort of 10 years to 1985 was when I first started writing about it when I was 20. I joined a local Earth Mysteries group because I was looking for people that had similar outlook to me at the time. And I joined this group which was called New Era, and that stood for the New Earth Quest Research Association. And at this point I met people which would influence me right up to this point. And all these people are referenced in the book. We used to go out on field trips to different places in and around Essex, and one of the older guys in the group at the time, he would take me out and show me all the secret spots in the land and on the coast, and places where sort of mask magic was practiced in the olden days, and indeed still is. Places of power, secret sites that people just don't know about, or didn't know about certainly. Some of the sites I haven't written about because they are still used to this day, they're still secret, and they're off the beaten track. But a lot of what I learned in the mid-80s and leading up to the mid-90s when I left Essex, the results of which I have put into this book. So it really has spanned most of my life. And I didn't actually plan to write this book, but as with so many people, at the beginning of the first COVID-19 lockdown, I found myself without full-time paid work for the first time in my life, and it started to make me feel a bit nostalgic in some way for the past. And I had time at this point in my life to start thinking about what I wanted to write about next. And bearing in mind I'd already started writing a new book about Cornish folklore, which is still ongoing at the moment, I sort of dropped that and decided I need to look back at my own past experiences in particular, and I just managed to rekindle this love of the Essex coast. And I think the point was that I'd inherited a lot of papers from my mum's house when she died a few years previously, and I found some old notes and old magazines in some of her papers which led me down a bit of a rabbit hole into a whole new world of Essex folklore that I hadn't remembered since I was a child. I found articles that I'd read, as I've previously mentioned, one by Raymond Lamont Brown about this Essex ghost hunter. I found articles that I'd obviously put little childhood notes on by Eric Maple on Essex witchcraft, and I thought, right, I better start actually having a look and seeing what's out there now. And I found that there wasn't actually a definitive book on the witchcraft, mystery and folklore of the Essex coast. There are lots of other books that mentioned it, but no one had brought this fascinating region's folklore together. And it really is well famous, you know. This part of the southeast coast of Britain is known as witch country, and it's known as witch country for a good reason. There are so many cases of known cunning folk and known witches, supposed witches that were tried for witchcraft in this small area of southeast England. And once I started to realise that we had all these names, all these lists of names, I started to look into it a bit more deeply. And what I found was fascinating, and it matched up with what I'd learned during the 1980s with my time out in the field with colleagues at the time. It seemed to marry up with what I'd learned then, although a lot of that was oral tradition. Here I was finding the actual proof of that oral tradition, if you like. So I spent the entire lockdown, the first lockdown, writing the Liminal Shore. And I couldn't go to Essex, which was really frustrating because I really wanted to get out to these sites that I'd known in my younger days to revisit and rekindle my interest. I was writing about these places and I was yearning to go for them, to go out to them. But what I found was I contacted a few museums out on the Essex coast, and they were really helpful. A lot of them had online archives, and a lot of them were happy to chat over Skype or Zoom or on the telephone And I quickly built up a network of people that would allow me access to webcams out on the coast, would send me like videos they'd made of their take on the Essex coast. So this book, The Liminal Shore, is about the other Essex, if you like, where coastal urban conceals much enchantment and the isolated rural marshlands reveals the arcane, and it really does. So I called it The Liminal Shore. I've had a bit of stick about the word liminal because it's used quite a lot these days, and I don't think people really quite necessarily understand what it means. I'm not even sure I did when I first wrote the book. So as people keep asking me about this, I thought I'd go through the word liminal. So what does liminal mean? Well, it means lots of things, and you'll see why I've called the book The Liminal Shore in a moment, I'm sure. So it's a transitional space, place or event, possibly. An adjective which describes the void between the familiar and the unknown. Occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary. Definitely in the case of the Essex coast. Being on the verge of something either physical or abstract. Read the book and you'll find out. A word that can be used to illuminate things that exist at a threshold or border between one thing and another. A portal into alternatives, for sure. A doorway into the nostalgia of your imagination. In my case, definitely. A space between past and present, or a place between land and sea. Betwixt and between, the abode of the shapeshifter. Or in the case of the Essex shore, the old devil himself. Or as he's known in Essex, that old coastal hobgoblin. So yeah, so this is why when I say to people I've written a book called The Liminal Shore, and they ask me what it's about, they'll either get it or they won't. And anyone that knows this piece of coast, or other coastlines similar, which are full of salt marsh, these alluvial spots on the landscape and seascape, which are neither one thing or another. At high tide they become sea. At low tide, they're vast, they're miles of expanses of salt marsh. You know, these are the worlds that are in between, and they're worlds where marsh wizards of Essex and the sea witches of Essex practice their folk magic and have done so for millennia. And until you actually visit these sites, you won't quite get it. But when you do visit one of these sites on the Essex shore, you will quickly realise why many generations of people have practiced magic on these sites. You know, people live out there. They live their day-to-day lives out there. You know, in the past you'd have had wildfowlers out there earning their living from as a sort of hunter-gatherer in the 18th and 19th centuries. But it's a liminal place. You've got the fishermen, you've got the wildfowlers, you've got the farmers, and then you've also got the cunning folk. And if you're interested in all these things and more, then have a look at my book, The Liminal Shore, because I've tried to bring all these subjects together under one title, and I look at everything from cunning traditions along the coast to trades guilds and their folklore, right through to the folklore of the old devil, which seems to crop up all along the Essex coast. We look at some of the more famous cunning folk, plus many of the folk out on the edge that have been forgotten, but now hopefully I've brought their names back to life. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce my book to you all, and I really hope that you get something out of it. And like me, you know, I certainly got an awful lot out of writing this during the time of lockdown. And when the world had gone liminal, I entered into my own liminal space and turned it into something creative. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. South Ockendon Green Man. In South Ockendon, in South Essex, the 13th century round-towered parish church of St Nicholas sits adjacent the village green and displays one of the best Essex examples of a green man. He sits in all his foliate splendour on the north wall, just to the east of the porch overlooking the village green. The Dagenham Idol is a most remarkable and fascinating object from the late Neolithic period. Discovered deep within the mud of the ancient Thameside marsh, the figure is carved from Scots pine and is believed to be around 4,300 years old. This exceptional and unique artefact is probably a representation of a local deity which was deposited as a sacrificial offering to the marshes by Neolithic hunter-gatherers. Devil and his demon dogs. The devil and his hounds haunt the isolated and spooky marshes around Salcott in Essex. They appear at dusk, chasing across the sky and into the grainy swamps of Salcott Creek. Here, under the light of the full moon and the glistening stars, they continue to haunt the marshes and collect the lost souls of long dead bargees and fishermen of the past. The black shuck appears frequently along the Essex shore, sometimes seen running along the sea wall, and at other times he may haunt isolated farms, desolate salt marsh, eerie churchyards and ancient crossroads. Often large and sinister in appearance, with glowing eyes, he has been witnessed for hundreds of years. Cunning Murrell's Angelic Protection Sigil. This sigil is based on an alleged original that was rediscovered by Arthur Morrison in 1900 during his Cunning Murrell research trip to Hadley, Essex. It was here that Morrison met with Murrell's son, who showed Morrison his father's wooden chest. It was full of books and papers, including the above sigil, which appears to show a handwritten angelic protection charm, possibly used by James Murrell himself. Munden Oak Grove. Sited on the Essex coast between the old and disused parish church of St Mary and the tidal salt marsh of Munden Creek, you will find an ancient oak grove. Although the trees are now dead, they still stand sentinel by the southern bank of the Blackwater estuary. Legend records them as at least 900 years old and marking the ancient site of a sacred druid grove. The Waterhouse Witch Family Imp. In 1566, Hatfield Peveril in Essex found itself and its 500 or so inhabitants at the centre of a witch trial, where 3 women were accused of practising sorcery. Agnes Waterhouse, her daughter Joan and her sister Elizabeth Frances were the family at the centre of these allegations. Agnes and Elizabeth were taught the ancient art of witchcraft by their grandmother, known as Mother Eve, which suggests that they may have been at least 4 generations of the family practising as folk magicians, cunning women and herbalists in the parish. Here we see a representation of the Family Familia, which was an 8-headed dog with a key and a chain and a whistle, and this was actually printed in the little pamphlet at the time of their execution. The St Osoph Dragon. There is a 12th century folk tradition that a dragon once prowled the St Osoph area of north-east Essex coast. It was described as a dragon of marvellous bigness, which burned buildings as it walked. The legend was repeated in a broadsheet published in 1704. The dragon is depicted in a carving on the late 15th century gatehouse of the Priory in St Osoph. The dragon sits on one side with St Michael opposite, decorating the entrance spandrels. The same style of dragon can also be seen carved on the porch at St Andrew's Churchyard at Fingringhoe.